This week on the 167, Pastor Rick is back and Charissa Motley joins us to talk about mutual submission. Welcome to the 167.
Hey, welcome back to the 167. My name is Rick, and I get the honor of hosting the 167 today.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is this the first that I sat in this chair?
No, you've done it.
Did I
I
do
think
it before?
once before.
One time before. So, anyway, it's good to be the host here. And joining me today is Pastor Lucas Motley.
Good day.
And see, I'm confused because the text message said one thing, but Charissa, his lovely wife, Charissa, I will not call you by the pet name that was on the text message.
I don't even know what that would be.
So welcome to the 167,
Thank
Charissa.
you.
So I've been out of the loop for a month.
Yeah.
And apparently we've been in this series on relationships.
Apparently.
Welcome back.
Yeah, no. So we sat down back in December and kind of mapped out kind of a game plan for the first few months of 2023, and the month of January was going to be a relationship-based series that ultimately is a reflection of the relationship that we as followers of Christ have with Christ and with God. Right? Mm-hmm. So we're in week 4. And we talked this past week, you had a message, and the primary focus was on the topic of unity, right? So start off just a little bit about this idea of being united or unity in a relationship.
I think really that is something like when we talk about the parallels between our relationships and Christ, like that is something that is something that's evident in Scripture, but I think in just our own relationships and our own marriages, like everybody knows when you're not on the same page, it causes strife, it causes arguments, it causes, financial difficulty, it causes all kinds of stuff. And eventually will, lead you to probably splitting up.
Yeah, so it's good to be unified.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a positive.
Yes.
Yeah, whether it be with Christ or your spouse.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of moving quickly then into the message, you started off talking about this idea of things being fair, right? And that's a big deal in any kind of relationship. Like we all want things to be fair. And you said that fair is...
It's not a thing.
It's not a thing.
Chris,
so
she's probably sick of hearing me say that.
We hear that a lot around our house.
Yeah, what people hear me say is, fair is where you get corn dogs and cotton candy.
Yeah,
right? So
that's good.
Yeah, we don't have corn dogs and cotton candy here. So what drove you to this place or ultimately led to a place of understanding that fair is not a thing?
I'm sure that you guys had experiences like growing up, but like for me, it was, I just had encountered that so many times where it's like, and my mom said this to me, quite a few times where it was like, do you really want me to be fair? Because here's what that means, and so she would outline what it is to be fair. And I was like, no, actually, I don't want that. So I think growing up, I had a really good sense of that, but also there's just so many times in life where you just encounter it over and over and over again. And you get to the breaking point where you go, life's not, everybody says, well, life's not fair. I'm like, sure, but nobody will tell you not to expect it. Like everybody still strives for it. So I don't know if you guys feel that where it's like, it's almost like you have to artificially, like you're expected to artificially manufacture it for people.
Yeah. So Charissa, do you, like when you think of the word fair, do you struggle with wanting things to be fair? And,
I do, but my parents very frequently in my childhood years would say, life's not fair, you better get used to it. So that was like, I feel like that's just a parent thing, right?
Yeah.
Like we say that to our kids all the time. But there is still that, I want it to be fair. Right? Like I don't, and I think you made a really good case that it's like what we really want is to, like, if we're the one who's in the wrong, we want it to be corrected, right? Like we want it to be fair when it benefits us. But if it benefits somebody else, then it's not really such a big deal, right?
Yeah. So as a parent, when you think of this thing of fairness, and you tell your kids, like we did, hey, life's not fair, yet you try to be fair, right, with your kids. So you don't, buy one of your daughters a brand new bicycle for their birthday, and the next one you're like, oh, here's some candy, right? And say, well, life's not fair. Get used to it. No.
Well, and if you and Trudy done that, like at Christmas, where you're like, well, we're spending X amount of dollars on this child, so then we have to spend X amount of dollars on this child.
Yeah, so you want it to be fair. And not only the amount of money that you spend on each of them, then because of that inner desire for things to be fair or to appear to be fair, then like you need to open the same number of gifts or close to the same, because you don't want someone saying they got 7 and I got 6 and that's not fair. It's like, so, we try our best to make things fair. Ultimately, though, understanding that fair is
not a thing.
Not a thing. Well, like you said, it's kind of funny when you were saying that. It made me think of, as parents, we do that when it's in between the two children. It's like so-and-so's cheating on this game and we go, hey, that's not fair. But then it's like, well, Dad, I want something from you. And then I go, well, life's not fair. It's about my benefit.
Yeah, exactly. So a couple other words that were used. So fair was one. Equality is another word. Unity. And sometimes equality and unity are kind of interchangeable in our culture. And people have used them inappropriately or tried to interject them in ways that don't really fit. So why does this appear to be to the world more satisfying than unity? So why does equality, like we want to be equal, why is that more appealing than for us to be in unity? And are those two interchangeable?
Yeah, I don't think that they are. And like I said, that's why I invited Chris on today, because I just want to hear, because sometimes as a man, like you don't value that because that's not part of our culture. And yet, with women, a lot of times it's like the culture is pressuring women to seek equality, as if like, if you don't do that, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah. Well, I do think that they're not the same. And I think you presented that really well in your sermon, where you were talking about equality culturally is this value of sameness, that we are all the same, right? Like,
so the word equal has been redefined in our culture, which is pretty prominent with a lot of words. So no longer is it we have equal value.
Right.
So we're going to change
or even
that.
Equal rights.
Yeah. So we're going to change that word equal to mean we have to be the same.
The same. Yeah. And so I was thinking about that old song. I don't even remember what it's from, but the anything you can do, I can do better. Right. And that is where we have started to, equality means, well, if you can do it, I can do it. And if I can do it, I have to do it better. And then it becomes competitive. And so we've taken equality to this height of like super intense pressure, right? That we have to, if you do something, I have to match it. And then if I do something, you have to match it. And I think you talked about, instead of giving things equal value and equal weight in a relationship, we're just saying two things are, like you said, bricks or feathers, right? Like they're not.
No, they're both important. They both have value.
Yes.
And in their uniqueness, right? They're equally as valuable.
Right.
But they are not equal in function at all.
Right. And I think that concept of sameness is what's really hurting us. As women, I think culturally, a lot of women want to be the same as men, because what they really want is to be valued the same as men. But we're not the same as men. Right. We're just not. And fundamentally.
And I'm very thankful.
Right. Me too. You know, there are things that I'm like, I'm glad this is your job. Yeah. I'm glad this is a thing that men do, because I don't want to do it. But yeah, I think that in terms of, not to get into the weeds too much, but feminism has taught us that, to be equal is the pinnacle, that you can do anything a man can do. And I think that unity is so much better, because it puts you on the same team instead of constantly competing against each other.
Yeah, and so in our culture, because we're redefining words and trying to shift different ideas, another word that is prominent now is not equal, it's equity.
Yeah,
So we want it to be
Yes.
equitable.
Yes.
So it's not just the same opportunities.
Right.
We want to ensure the same outcomes.
Yep.
And so, yeah, you're stronger than Carissa. Is he strong? Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Barely.
For sure.
Barely.
No,
So,
for sure.
Yeah. So you're stronger than Carissa, but so Carissa could say, well, that's not fair. And so we're equal, but you're stronger than me. So now we have to have some measure, some avenue to make me appear to be as strong as you, or it's just not right.
It's
so
not
we have to
fair.
have equal outcomes, not just equal opportunities.
Yeah, there's an incredible short story, and I'm going to lose the name. What is the short story where the guy receives all the handicaps?
Oh, that is a Kurt Vonnegut short story. I'll get back to you on that.
Well,
title of it.
we're going to find the title for you in just a second because you should go and read this. But it's really, it's about the most in the future. It's like a dystopian thing where it's in the future people receive handicaps. So if you're too fast, they put heavier shoes on you to pull you down to everybody else's level. And so it's about the man who's the most handicapped in the world. So he wears a bag over his head because he's handsome, and he has to sit in a wheelchair because he's too tall. And it's like all of these things that he's strapped down with because he's so amazing.
Yeah.
And it's like in marriage relationships, a lot of times we are trying to do that. Like that's happening culturally too, because like I said, you can't necessarily always lift someone up, but you can pull someone back.
Right.
But that happens in our marriages where it's like, well, you're succeeding and that makes me look bad. So now it's not that I'm going to step up to the plate. It's now I have to make you look bad, and I have to make myself look better.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, that's a recipe for disaster. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
And it applies like as husband and wife in the role of parenting. You're not equal, like, yes, equal in value, like, but the role of a father is different than the role of a mother. Right. And you explained that a little bit about single mother homes, single father homes. So what you do within that relationship differs, but you're still valuable, right? Yet somehow we try to devalue one and increase the value of another. And what it causes, like in parenting, is then a lack of unity, and kids pick up on that, right? And so then they're like, oh, if I don't get the right answer here, I'll go over there. And then kids are wise. Then they pit you against each other and try to create this disunity, right? And it's like,
one of you is the fun parent, and one of you is the no parent.
Yep. And so then it, again, recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. Then you talked about a beloved subject that, man, the ladies love to talk about this, another word, submission.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, boy. And it's, again, because it's been redefined, right? It's not, people use it in a way that it was never intended to be used. So submission, right, centered on this idea of respect. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I tried to be specific where I was like, respect, I think, in my opinion, is what I call trusted deference, which is you disagree with somebody, and then you're able to look at them and say, listen, I don't necessarily agree with that, but I trust you that you either can handle it. I trust you that you understand the problem. I trust you that you have my best interest at heart. So I'll go along with that. Like we'll still do it together. I'm not going to be the guy that's like, well, I trust you, and then the minute it goes sideways, be like, I told you. Like it's just, hey, I trust and respect you, therefore I will follow you. And I think that that's just been lost in our culture where, like I said, it's supposed to be mutual submission in our marriages, but ultimately, if you're following that biblical model, I don't feel like there's any way around that. Like I said, I've heard plenty of sermons where they're like, well, really? And I'm like, no, like for women, their role is to trust their husbands. And that makes it really hard because husbands haven't been, pulling our weight. And it's like, but that's what we're called to, I think. But
yeah. So Carissa, from a wife perspective, from a female perspective, I know this idea of submission looks and feels a lot different from the female side. As most guys would be like, well, yeah, like what's the big deal? But from a female perspective, why is that a big deal? Why is it difficult?
So I will say that, again, there are a lot of things happening around the word submission, and I'm actually really passionate about helping women come to a place where we don't think of submission as a dirty word anymore, because I think that has happened very much. Like, it feels yucky to be told as a wife that you have to be submissive to your husband. I think that can feel really gross. I love the definition that you use, the trusted deference, and then the idea of mutual submission. And as always, pointing that back to, do you submit to Christ, right? Like, all of that is part of it. But I think you've got these decades coming against us, telling us that submission is weakness and submission is just letting your husband run your life. And it's funny, you guys were talking about toxic purity culture last week. And so there's actually this movement right now on TikTok, which I don't have, but I have read about this movement. It's called the trad wife movement. So it's Gen Zers, young women who are saying, I want to go back to like more of a 1950s housewife model. I want to stay home. I want to cook. I want to garden. I want to raise my kids. And if you start to dig into that, everyone commenting on that is like, this is terrible. This is such a bad idea. We cannot go back in time. This is undermining all we've done for women's rights. And, and so it's like you just see the pushback against the idea of submission all the time. And I think that as women, we get that in our heads because culture is telling us it's bad. Submission is bad. Submission makes you less in your marriage and less in your relationships. And I think that's what we're constantly fighting against in the church, right? Is it like Jesus never said submission makes you weak, right?
No,
never, right? And he had a very different perspective on what that means. And so I just think we have to start reclaiming the real true definition of submission in order to function well in our marriages.
So part of that, redefining of words or misunderstanding words, submission is one of those that falls into that category because I think for a lot of women, probably even for a lot of men, it has this undertone that hints towards abusiveness or, like, why would I want to submit? Because, then I'm opening myself up to this abusive behavior.
Yeah.
Right.
That was never part of the intention of Christ in this word to be submissive.
Which is funny because, like, the people that value traditional roles, Christ followers, like people of religion, like nobody's advocating for abuse. Like if anybody, we would be people who are like, no, we are the people that take those people in and try and show them the love of Christ and then like try and help them out. Where it's just funny because it's like, well, that's it's going to be cover for abuse, and it's like, no. Christians, we'd be the first one to tell you you're supposed to love each other and not do that. But like, you can ask, and this is the thing, like, kind of around this topic is you can ask people all day long, what takes more control, what takes more power, to be arrogant or to be humble? And people would say, well, it takes more power to be humble. And it's like, great, then submission is a higher value necessarily than being in control. And people are like, well, no, you can't be in submission. I'm like, no, that is a greater thing. Like that is an incredible thing. It takes an incredible amount of strength and humility and control in your life.
Yeah, but because of this misunderstanding of the word, it makes it hard to
it's no longer something to aspire to.
And so I was thinking about how we've all heard the saying, I know just enough to be dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, there are lots and lots of people, non-Christian people, who know just enough of the Bible.
Right.
And this is one of those verses that a lot of abusive men, so they use this and say, you're supposed to be submissive to me. That's what the Bible says, right? Well, yes, that is what the Bible says, right? But they don't know enough to know what that really means. And so it just propagates this idea of abuse because the word itself is misused in so many areas. So,
and they never get to that next part where you're supposed to die for your wife.
Yeah, so it starts off, husbands, love your wives. So ultimately, if a husband is loving his wife like Christ loved the church, and you can speak into this, Charissa, I believe from a female perspective, if a husband is loving his wife in that way, the submission part is willingly entered into. It's like, yes, I would love to submit to you. The resistance is when you're not loving me the way Christ loved the church. That's where is that kind of
and I think that you hit on this I thought you did really well at talking to men and women yesterday. But I think you hit on this, and we've talked about this before, so this won't come as a surprise to you. But that there was a point in our marriage where you really took on the mantle of being the spiritual leader of our household. Once we had children, and you just like really jumped into that role. And that for me became so inspirational. That was something that I could look at you. And again, it really increased the amount of trust that I had in you. I knew that you were going to lead me and lead our children in a direction that was in line with God. And that made it easy to go, oh yeah, I mean, that makes complete sense, right? Like I absolutely trust you with this.
Well, and to be clear, been a minister almost my entire life. And that wasn't until we were in our 30s. You know, like we were in our 30s, had children, and, you know, like I said, I just started to, and I started to seek the Lord and really let the Holy Spirit take over, you know, my whole life. And it was like, you actually sat me down and you're like, you are different. And so like that was I think a turning point for our marriage where it was like, but that was because I finally stepped up to responsibility in those areas.
Well, we've kind of hinted around or talked a little bit about Ephesians 5 without really reading or digging into Ephesians 5. And that was one of the passages that you used in your sermon. So the question is, how does Ephesians 5 and the truth of Christ being our groom speak into how we live, regardless of whether we're married or not? Yeah. So this is about relationship with us and Christ, not just relationship between husband and wife. So how does that Ephesians 5?
Well, I think that's what's foundational for me. That was the big aha, which inspired this series, was there are some things in the Bible that I think that we're debating on the top of the iceberg. And if you go to the root of it, it's like I asked that question this week where I said, how many of you say I want to serve Christ? And everybody's like, yes. And I'm like, well, how many of you want to serve your husbands? And it's like,
maybe not.
Right. And so there are certain things in the Bible like you are supposed to do this because of this deeper rooted thing. And I think Ephesians 5 tells us, just like that submission part of it, is that Christ, you know, it's this beautiful picture where Christ gives us his name, he gives us his authority, and all we have to do is let him protect us. You know, like that's that submissive role is, you know, for wives and husbands, it's like just let him take responsibility for you. Let him protect you. You don't have to do it yourself. You don't have to be, you know, a single mom. In Christianity, you don't have to just live this life by yourself. You can have a savior come and take responsibility for you, give you his name so that you can honor it. And all you have to do is submit underneath that authority and that covering. And like, that's a beautiful thing. And if you're outside of that, you just, you risk a whole bunch of stuff.
It's such a beautiful picture, yet there's something about it that's difficult you know, to actually live out. And like, there have been times when I've met with couples and gone through Ephesians 5, and I will say, okay, when you look at this passage, let's put it to real life. So what this passage is saying is, like I would say, so Lucas is Jesus in this scenario.
Write it down. Quoted by Pastor Rick George.
So Lucas is Jesus, and Charissa, you're the church. Okay, so how does that relationship, and you can just, like, almost immediately, people are like, oh, I don't like where this is going.
Right,
like, I don't, it feels wrong. It feels wrong.
Yeah.
It feels wrong to be Jesus. It feels wrong that I'm supposed to submit. But that's exactly what it's saying. Right? I mean, that's the point, that my role as a husband is to love like Jesus. Like, I'm the picture that he's painting. And
every aspect of our lives is supposed to be a testimony of Christ.
Well, and I think too, you know, to go back to something that you said in your message also, like when we think about how this plays out in our relationship with Christ, you know, in Ephesians 5, is wives submit to your husbands because of this, as the church submits to Christ, so wives should submit to your husbands. And you made the point that, like, we can't make the decisions for Christ, right? Like, Jesus is not bending himself to what we think.
Yes.
Right? Like, ultimately, we have to submit to, you know, what he has laid out for us. And he doesn't go, oh, I'll let the churches figure it out for themselves, and whatever they come up, like, that's kind of a joke you made. Like, whatever they come up with, I'll just go with it. That sounds totally great. That would be awful, right? That would be a disaster. And so I think for me, thinking about submission in that context, right, that, like, it is not a good idea for us to be left to our own devices
Right.
and try to override what Christ has established, right? And so that makes, I recognize that that's foolish, right? I might still want to do it sometimes, but I recognize that it's a bad idea, right? So I think that if you can take, like, as the church submits to Christ, so wives should submit to your husbands, going, okay, so I recognize that there's a value in this and that there is something, there's something fundamentally important about equating those two things, right?
Yeah.
Looking at Christ and then the marriage
The
relationship.
design is intentional, and if
Absolutely.
you want to follow.
And whether you're married or not, it's still a romance story. It's still a story of Christ coming for you.
Yep. So what's at stake what's at stake for marriage and relationship with Christ in this idea of disunity? Like, if we're not in unity, what's the end game of that?
I just think, like, I've counseled different couples and stuff, and a lot of times when people are going through marital problems, they'll say, well, we're going to go see separate counselors and figure out ourselves. And I'm going, all of that does is separate those two cogs, and it teaches you how to function without each other. It's like those, like, yes, maybe you should get some individual counseling, but you should also be seeing a counselor together, because what it does is it's an uncoupling, and it's teaching you to function by yourself. And even in our own relationships, when we start to function without our spouses, when we value and go, I don't need you, it's the pickle jar, I can open my own pickle jar kind of a thing. When you do that, you uncouple together, and there's less and less reason to stay together. And I think that's true spiritually, where the more that we try and live our lives without Christ, without a real reliance on the miraculous power of God to change us, like, then there's an uncoupling of God, and I don't need him.
Yeah.
And so there's no reason for the relationship.
Well, so I'll ask Chris, so would you agree that sometimes it's true that it's easier to just do it yourself?
Yes.
Or without, like, so
Yeah,
so it's not a
definitely.
question about
Right.
ease,
Yep.
right? So,
Yep.
so why would you do something that's more difficult in the short term?
I mean, I think ultimately we all want our own way, right? It comes back to fairness. It's not fair that you are the head. Right? I mean, I think that sometimes we can get into this deep-seated, sense of justice that, well, in some way that this squashes me or devalues me or makes you more important. And we have had a lot of these conversations, and when we talk about roles in our own marriage, that it's not that this one thing is more important than this other thing. We do try to lean into our strengths and see, like, here's what we're both bringing to the table. But when you let those little things start to separate you, I think that is really, it's really hard to pull back together, because you become so focused on your own sufficiency and your own independence and your own, capability and your own strength, which all of those things too, when we try to live apart from Jesus, we're doing the same thing.
Exactly.
And we find that is way harder than just coming together and letting someone come alongside you with that.
So oftentimes we sacrifice the short-term pleasure or benefit for the, and we miss out on the long-term
Right.
benefit of doing it God's way. 2 minutes left. What are your final thoughts in the last 2 minutes?
I would just ask that same question I ask is, what's in it for you? Where it's like to use the pickle jar example, where it's like, well, I can do this myself. Cool. Congratulations. Good job being alone. It's like, just to really ask those questions at home, like, what are you striving for, and what does that actually get you?
Yeah.
I would ask couples to sit down and ask, what does this really do for me?
Perfect.
Well, and I think for wives, for women, again, this can be a really touchy area, and it can be something that we get really sensitive about. And I think, if you need to work through and study what submission means biblically, if you need to get in a good headspace about that, then do that, because it's really important that you and your husband come together and function as a team and make those cogs that you kept talking about in the wheel, that they work together, because it's better for your marriage and it's better for your kids and ultimately everything in the long run.
Absolutely.
And husbands should take out the trash immediately.
Yeah, exactly. So when you talked about the pickle jar, and I'll end with this, back in the day, Dr. Laura Schlesinger. I don't know if you remember the Dr. Laura, but she wrote a book called The Proper Care and Feeding of Men. And she said the same thing. She said, wives, don't nag your husband to take the trash out. What you say to him is, honey, the last time you took the trash out, I noticed when you pulled the bag out, like your biceps were just popping, and man, that is hot. And she said, I guarantee you, next week, husbands are going to be over there, honey, look at this. And so, you got to learn. It's playing the game, right? You got to stroke the ego. Well,
Absolutely.
hey, thanks for joining us on the 167. Thank you guys for being part of the broadcast today, and we will see you back here next time.
If you enjoyed this episode of the 167, make sure you like, subscribe, follow, get notified, leave a 5-star rating and a positive review. Tell all your friends to listen as well. Make sure you go over to newlifegardener.com and check out all that we have to offer as a church, and check out our messages online as well. Thanks for listening.